The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello, welcome. Charles Christian here with another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. Thanks for tuning in again. And just before we get on with today's show, here's a short public service announcement. You can now also find the Weird Tales Radio Show on Amazon Music. That's in addition to YouTube, Mixcloud, SoundCloud, Spotify, all major podcast platforms, plus 35 internet and FM radio stations. Now, for our main event, which this week features an interview with the legendary Arthurian legends scholar and author John Matthews. Over the last 40 years, John has produced over 140 books on myths, the world of the Fae, the Holy Grail, and the legends of King Arthur. He also writes short stories, poetry, and children's books, and in 2003 was the historical advisor for the Jerry Bruckheimer movie King Arthur. In today's interview, we are primarily talking to John about the legends and history surrounding King Arthur's magician, Merlin, a man of many guises, from druid to Celtic warrior, to shaman, to prophet, to wizard, to royal advisor, and even a lover. And we'll also be looking at Merlin's enduring popularity. There can't be many people who started out in early medieval chronicles and who are still the subject of movies and TV series today. And it's my great pleasure to be talking to John Matthews. And John's the author of a huge number of books, as I said in the intro. But the one we're talking about today is the Book of Merlin, Magic, Legend and History. So good to speak to you, John.
Good to talk to you, Charles. Let's
start off with the concept of Merlin, because I see from your notes that you've written a lot of books about the Arthurian legends and the Grail studies. And of course, for most people, Merlin is perceived as a bit of a bit part character in King Arthur, who disappears halfway through the story and we never hear of him again. So, take us through, I don't know whether you want the classic chronicle of Merlin, or how do you want to pitch him?
Well, I'd like to pitch him as being a bit more on the scene than, he may appear to be, from what you just said, which is indeed the usual way that people tend to see that figure. And also, he's become, I think largely due, unfortunately, to Walt Disney's Sword in the Stone, something of a comic character. And this was based on T.H. White's book as well, The Once and Future King, which did make Merlin a rather comic character. But in actual fact, he's quite serious, and he's been around for a very long time, probably right back at least as far as the 6th century, when he may even have been an actual historical figure, not a magician, but a prince who led some of his warriors into battle, went mad as a result of witnessing the carnage, fled into the woods and lived as a wild man. And somehow out of this story, which is a very unfamiliar one to, I imagine, most people thinking of Merlin, he evolved into the sort of eminence grise, I suppose you could say, for King Arthur. He's the one who helps Arthur be born to begin with, then helps him to become king by arranging the sword in the stone, and then becomes his advisor. And it is true what you say, that in many of the versions, particularly the most well-known one, which is Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, he does disappear about the third of the way into the story, when he is apparently so besotted on one of the ladies of the lake that he lets her shut him up in a cave or under a rock or within a tree, depending on which version you like. And so from that reason, he's also been seen as a bit of an old womanizer, really.
Yeah.
Bit of an old dog, if you like.
Yeah.
Again, I think is a misreading, partly, I have to say, a misreading of the medieval writers, but even more a misreading of the modern ones.
And you just mentioned there that they may actually have been based on a historical character.
Yes, there's quite a lot of information concerning a prince of Strathclyde called Merlin, which is how the Welsh spell Merlin and how they pronounce it. And he seems to have been, as I said, a warrior, a leader of men, and incidentally a prophet.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's this prophetic aspect, which is where you then begin to get the first signs of the magical character that he's going to become. He also left behind a whole collection of poetry, which is still around, believe it or not. It wasn't copied down until quite a lot later in time. So, of course, there's always the argument that maybe it wasn't actually written by him.
Mm-hmm.
It's attributed to him. And it's very interesting because most of it is prophetic. It's full of this king will follow that king, and this lord will fall in battle, and this battle will be lost, and this battle will be won. All of them, of course, from after the event. So it's easy to say, well, they're all made up.
Yeah.
But there's a thread running through them that's quite interesting. It tells a completely different story to the one we're more familiar with. And that was really where I started from when I began to write this book. I started by saying, well, what can we really say about this character, particularly that hasn't been said before or that hasn't been said very often? And I started with him as a shaman.
Right.
The idea that as one of these people who can literally, can work with spirits and can see into the future and, can journey into other states of being, if you put him in that context, then the poetry and those earlier stories of him begin to fall into place.
We've got a historical character, and he is approximately the same point in history that people now think if there was a warrior chieftain called Arthur, it would have been somewhere around that time, the post-Roman Empire period when the Saxons were making inroads, that type of point in history.
Yes, I mean, in fact, there is now some evidence. In fact, I'm working on a book on it, funnily enough, that Arthur may have lived in the 2nd century and can be identified with a Roman centurion named Lucius Artorius Castus. Artorius, of course, being the Latin for Arthur.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's lots of evidence suggesting that. But as you say, there is also a great sort of general agreement that there was an Arthur. And I think there's probably more than one, but there certainly was an Arthur who was around, or seems to have been around, between the 5th and 6th centuries. Some people would say that Merlin is a bit later than this, but I think actually that he was contemporary, and that this is where we first get the link between these two enormously important and exciting characters.
In your book, you have divided it up into Merlin the shaman, Merlin the prophet, Merlin the magician, Merlin the lover, and Merlin the sage. Take us through, you've already mentioned the shamanistic side of things and some of the prophecy bits, but how did he sort of move through all these different facets?
Well, I think it's partly the way in which he was seen at the time. For each era has its own version of Merlin, just as each era has its own version of Arthur. And I think that therefore each new generation who came along, who wrote about him, did so putting him into the terms that they understood at the time. So in actual fact, I discovered, and I only really discovered this while I was writing this book, that in no text is he actually called a magician. He's never called Merlin the magician at any point. He's usually just called Merlin. And if he's called anything, if he's given any kind of distinct description, it's never magician. It's usually prophet or wise man or seer. It's never a magician. But to the medieval writers who called him that, and I'm thinking particularly of Mallory, of course, because Mallory gives us the most rounded portrait, I think, of Merlin. For him, that meant a magician. That meant, someone who could conjure things, who could see into the future again. So the prophetic aspect is still there, but I've got the magical aspect that he can, as he does in one of the stories, he can stop a battle just by raising a hand, and he can knock people out by just looking at them. He can do all kinds of things that would be associated in the medieval writers as the idea of a magician. So then you begin to get this whole thing where he's not just Arthur's advisor, he's also said to have built the castle of Camelot overnight and to have created the Round Table in a few moments. And, you get the whole idea of this sort of very powerful, mysterious figure that really is at the heart of a lot of the medieval Arthurian stories.
Mm-hmm. And again, as you mentioned, you said he was the person who enabled Arthur to be born. This is going back to the fact that Arthur's father had, again, trying to remember all the various different versions, he was able to seduce Arthur's mother by taking on the appearance of her lover. Is that?
That's we're talking about Uther Pendragon here, who in virtually every version of the stories is Arthur's father. And he really falls for Lady Igraine, who is the wife at that time of the Duke of Cornwall. And there's a battle that takes place for her, for control of her. And this all takes place at Tintagel, that wonderful site, down there in Cornwall, which actually has almost nothing to do with Arthur at all, but it's become associated with him. And so there's this wonderful dramatic scene where Uther is given the shape of Gorlois, which is the husband of Igraine, and rides out of the castle looking like that, and goes off to Igraine, gets her into bed, and begets Arthur. All this organised by Merlin. If you know the movie Excalibur, wonderful scene in that where he does this, and Uther rides out through the mist and ends up with Igraine. And there's a rather unfortunate love scene where he makes love to her wearing armour, which I think the audience, when I saw that movie first, went, ouch!
Yes. Yes.
But hope that's okay for your audience.
Oh, yes.
But yes, so I mean, he does literally. He is literally there. He's read it in the stars. He sees a vision of a comet shaped like a dragon and says, "This is the dragon that is to come, who will become the most famous king of Britain." And so Arthur is born, and Merlin carries him off. Merlin comes as soon as the child is weaned. He comes along and says, "Right, I'm taking him now to train him and teach him." And first thing he does is to take him to a knight called Sir Ector and his wife, who live in a forest. And he doesn't tell them who he is, but just asks him to look after this baby. And so they bring up the boy. But Merlin keeps popping in from time to time to keep an eye on him or to train him in some way. We know very little about this. I've actually recently written the first of a quartet of children's books, overall title The Red Dragon Rising, which is all about Merlin's training of Arthur, because I realized that really nobody has ever fully described it. T.H. White did so a little bit in The Sword in the Stone, but he made it more funny. So I wanted to bring out the magical aspects, and I wrote this book a couple of years back now, which is the first of 4 that will take Arthur through his young years until the point when he becomes king.
Mm-hmm.
So all that's going on. Merlin is in the background, teaching Arthur, getting him ready. And then when the time comes, you have the other great dramatic scene that I think most people know about, which is the sword in the stone,
Mm-hmm.
which Merlin sets up by having this sword with an anvil on top of it and a sword driven into that. And it appears in the churchyard of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And there's a huge gathering of knights and warriors and lords and would-be kings, and they all come and try drawing the sword from the stone. And, of course, the only one who can do it is, in the end, the boy Arthur. And so he is proclaimed king. And then there are various other kings who don't like that idea, so there's a bit of war goes on.
Yes.
Finally, Arthur is crowned and founds the Round Table, and the rest, as they say, is not history but wonderful legend.
Yes. Now, one of the other aspects I think a lot of people aren't aware of is that Merlin's not just a feature of English history. I mean, in Breton history, he features as well. And indeed, he's supposedly imprisoned forever in one of the forests in Brittany, isn't he?
Yes, he is. We're talking about Bristol.
Yes.
An actual place. It does actually exist. It sadly was decimated by a fire about 20 years ago, but now it's grown back again. It's a wonderful atmospheric place, and there is actually a site there which is known as Merlin's Well, the Fountain of Barenton. And it's a local legend. That's where he used to come to drink. There are lots of stories about the older Merlin, about him going mad and then being restored to full health and sanity by drinking from a well that had special properties. So I think this idea has transferred itself, along with a lot of other ideas and traditions, and there he is, supposedly hidden somewhere in a cave, somewhere in the forests there. And there are a lot of very strong traditions from the area. I have friends who live there, and they're always saying, "Oh yes, we expect to meet Merlin any day," because it has that feeling, has that kind of haunted and mysterious feeling to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But Merlin was certainly a universal figure. I mean, he starts out, as I said, probably in Britain, maybe in Scotland, maybe in Northumberland. There are different possibilities for that. No absolute certainty. And then once the Arthurian legend really gets going, which is really in the 12th century, among the various romances that come along, you get these stories of growing. The stories grow, and the French pick it up, and there's this enormous, gigantic sequence of stories known as the Lancelot Grail. It used to be called the Vulgate Cycle, but they changed the name for some reason. Mm-hmm. This is like an 8-volume, a massive set of books that tell the whole story of Arthur, and of course Merlin has a whole book. He has, the Book of Merlin, so like mine, and that's when you begin to get, shall we say, some of the more romantic aspects. This is where I called Merlin the lover. And I know some people were and will be quite surprised by that because, as I said earlier, for a lot of people, Merlin is just a silly old man who falls in love with a young girl and does his best to have his way with her, and she doesn't have it. She persuades him to tell her his magic, and then she shuts him up.
Yeah.
But there's much more to it than that, because the character, who's usually called Nimue, and at the moment that's a familiar name to everybody because there's a TV series called Cursed, which Nimue is her is the name of the heroine in that, and it appears in that. But Nimue is really a fairy woman,
right? Yeah.
She's immortal, and she is. It's not about her tricking Merlin into giving away his secrets and then shutting him up. What this actually is, you have to go back a bit now. You have to track back to those poems that I told you about at the beginning. In those, we have another character who also appears in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Life of Merlin, which is a 12th century text. And in that, it's his sister, and she's called Ganida. And when Merlin's been active for quite a long time, he gets a bit tired of human beings and all the mess they keep making of their lives.
Yep.
And so he decides to retire, and he wants to go and live in the forest. And he asks Ganida to make him an observatory with 72 doors and windows. And he's going to sit in there and he can watch the stars and he can see with his inner sight all the things that are going on outside in the world. And so he goes off, and later on Ganida joins him and they live together in the forest. Now, to the medieval mind, this sounded just a little bit dodgy. It sounded a little bit possibly like incest. So basically they changed the character. Instead of it being Merlin's sister, who was said to be just as wise as he and to have a prophetic quality, they invented this other character called Nimue or Ninian, for various different names. And they turned her into this wily, otherworldly lady who tricks Merlin into giving him all his secrets, and then shuts him up, in the way that you hear in the stories.
Right.
So there's a whole difference in
yes.
there.
That's the one I'm familiar with, and that's the one that, to an extent, although they changed the characters again in the movie you mentioned at the outset, Excalibur. That's a similar plot line in there, though I think they have it as it's Morgana Le Fay, King Arthur's sister, who's the temptress in that one.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, John Borman, who's a good friend of mine, and we've discussed this lots of times, really did a wonderful job in conflating these very separate stories into one, because it's very hard to try to tell this enormous, vast canvas of stories, so quickly and easily in less than 2 hours. I took some wonderful shortcuts, including that one, because Morgan Le Fay, or Morgana Le Fay, who's often confused. In fact, there are two sisters. There's Morgana and Morgause. And because of the similarity in names, they're often confused. But Morgause was actually Arthur's half-sister as well. And he does sleep with her, and the result is Mordred,
right,
who becomes Arthur's nemesis at the end. So he is an incest. There is an incest story there, but the incest story doesn't exist for Merlin.
Right.
It's a different way of looking at it,
yes.
For the particularly who wrote down most of these stories from the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, such a thing was just not on,
yes. So according to then one version, Merlin and his sister, who is not in a sexual relationship with him, are still to this day sitting in their room with the 72 windows, watching the stars and the world.
That's if you read the story, yes, properly, I think that is exactly what's happening, so, and this is why you still get people today saying that they've, had contact with Merlin and that Merlin has told them this and that, but he's never really gone away, he's always been underneath whatever other aspect of him you have is a man who radiates wisdom, if you like. This is why I called the last of the chapter was the Merlin the Sage, because this wisdom, it seems to be, it goes with him through all of the versions of the stories. He always knows what's going on. He understands the elements. He understands history. He understands all the tides that govern history and humanity to some extent. And he has a vast reservoir of wisdom. I mean, there's a wonderful story. This is in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Life of Merlin, the Vita Merlini, which is a 12th century text. And he gives that very different version that I've been talking about, including the sister Ganida. He even gives Merlin a wife called Gwendolina. And in that, he has a scene where Merlin has retired already to his house in the woods, and another famous poet and seer who's called Taliesin, see him. And the two of them sit there, and what do? Something terribly typically British. They talk about the weather. But they don't just talk about the weather in the way we might say, it's a bit cold today, or it's a bit warmer, isn't it? They talk about what causes the weather and how the gods created the worlds that have the weather. So it's like there's this huge sort of cosmological quality to what they're talking about as well.
Yeah.
So you get this all the way through. You get Merlin's wisdom as well as Merlin the wily wizard, or Merlin the clever enchanter, or Merlin the old boy who falls for the young girl. They're all in there, but Merlin the wise man perhaps is the one I think that is most common to all of them.
Yeah. What about for people who've read some of the Arthurian legends and books and seen some of the movies and the like? What seems confusing is Camelot is built and there's wise Merlin helping it set it up, and then it all really falls to pieces. Lancelot and Guinevere thing, and it all ends rather abruptly and sadly. Where is Merlin in this? Has he sort of thrown his hands up at the foibles of humans and their passions and desires and just left them to get on with it? Or
well, yes, in a way that is kind of what he does. I mean, you see, there are so many layers to these stories. And I mean, we've got the historical, magical, fantasy aspects. We've also got the spiritual aspect. And this, of course, is the Grail.
Yeah.
In effect, the quest for the Grail has more to do with the breaking up of the Fellowship and the Round Table than the Lancelot and Guinevere does. I mean, they're, if you like, the last straw that breaks it all down. And I think this is one of the things that has kept people reading these stories for so long, is the fact that they have this wonderful kind of human nature aspect to them. People don't just behave like heroes do in these ancient medieval stories so often. They're not just figureheads. They are real people. They feel, they bleed, they fall in love, they destroy things, they break things. And Merlin seems to be almost baffled by this. I mean, this, I think, goes right back to where does Merlin come from? Because we haven't looked at that. But the origin of Merlin is very interesting, because you have the stories, and these are some of the earliest stories, that he is in fact born of a devil. Gets him on an innocent woman, possibly a nun, possibly a princess, again, depending which story you follow. And he's really been, he is brought into the world to cause chaos and destruction. But we remember now we're into the Christian era, when things were interpreted slightly differently. Yeah. He is baptized, and that baptism makes him different. So he has all the cleverness, all the magic, and all the power of a demon, but in fact he's a good man, or a good creature, one could say. Can't even be sure whether we could call him entirely human. But he seems to be there to observe almost, and he observes the way that humans behave and the way they treat each other and what happens and goes on around them. And in the end, he kind of does indeed, as you said, throw up his hands and go, well, I can't do anymore. I've done all I can. He sets up everything ready for the Grail quest. He creates the Round Table. He shows Arthur a vision of the Grail. He tells them it's going to happen. He describes it. And then he leaves them to it. And of course, all the knights of the Round Table go off in search of the Grail. Lots of them die. Only 3 of them are semi-successful: Galahad, Percival, and Bors. These are 3 very different knights. Galahad is Lancelot's son, and he's so saintly that he's almost not human at all. He's a very unusual character. And he's the one who finally gets the Grail, if you like. But he died. He dies, in a moment of ecstasy, if you like, and is carried off to heaven. And Percival goes back to the castle where the Grail used to be kept and guards it And Bors, who's, if you like, the ordinary man, he's the equivalent of the man in the street, goes back to Camelot and tells the whole story. But by this time, Merlin is out of the picture. And it's interesting that, again, if we go back to Excalibur and beyond that to the book by T.H. White, the last part of it, actually, Merlin comes back right at the end and tells Arthur, you've done a good job. Tomorrow's not going to be a good day for you. The Battle of Camlan is coming. Your bastard son is going to, wipe everyone out, which is exactly what happens. And Merlin predicts these things. He predicts them early on, and he predicts them again in that story by actually appearing to Arthur like a spirit and just saying, well, this is it. But that gives Arthur a sense of hope. And I think it's best caught in that wonderful moment at the end of the musical version, Camelot, where, Arthur and Merlin are together. And Arthur is given hope by Merlin's appearance and by the understanding that his story will not be forgotten. So it's those words, let it not be forgot. I'm paraphrasing here, that once there was known as Camelot, wonderfully sung by Richard Harris in the movie. And it's like that dream has gone on. You've got the White House and President Kennedy being associated with stories of Arthur and Merlin again. Because Kennedy absolutely loved the story, and in some ways, I think, saw himself as a new Arthur. So the stories have never really died out, and Merlin has always been right there, even though, as you said at the beginning, halfway through, he kind of vanishes. But he's still watching. He's still there in the place in the forest, hidden inside a hawthorn bush, in a cave, under the ground. And you get stories about some of the knights, going near there and hearing his voice. It's called the Cri de Merlin in the French, and it's Merlin's cry. And you get knights like Gawain who rides along and hears Merlin speaking from under the ground and says, what can I do? Can I get you out? And Merlin says, no, I'm here forever, but tell the king all is well, and that sort of thing, gives some more prophecies. So even though he's not physically present, he's still his ideas and prophecies are still going on.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because we always have this story, and it crops up in a lot of folk tales as well, about King Arthur and his knights being asleep underneath in a cave somewhere, waiting to be called at England's hour of need. But really, Merlin's doing the same thing, isn't he?
Well, he is, yes, and sometimes Merlin is shown as sleeping or arranging it again. The more modern folklore, which probably doesn't really go back much further than the 17th century, speak of him as being, of actually. Well, there's a very famous story told about Alderley Edge.
Yes.
Which Alan Garner wrote about in one of his books. And that one says that there's a man who's going to the market, wants to sell his horse. And on the way, he meets a mysterious old man who wants to buy the horse. But the farmer with the horse says, no, I can get better money in the market. So he goes to the market, can't sell the horse. On his way back, there's the old man who says, right, now will you sell it to me? And he takes the man into a cave under the Alderley Edge, and there he sees all of Arthur's knights ranged around in a circle sleeping, and the king himself sitting at a table with his beard grown immensely long and his fingernails grown immensely long, but fast asleep. And the mysterious figure reveals himself to Merlin and says that, he needed a new horse to replace one of the other horses for the day when the knights and Arthur will wake up. And that's it. And then the farmer wakes up outside and can't find the way into the hill, of course, because it's been hidden again. No sign of it. He's got a pocket full of gold and he's happy, goes home. But that story is told in 4 or 5 different places around the country, under Edinburgh, under Arthur's seat. where I gather they've just found signs of an old Roman fort or pre-Roman fort even on top of the hill, which no one knew about. So the stories continue, and somehow Merlin is always there, guiding the steps of those who even coming after Arthur.
He's been a huge cultural phenomenon in more modern times with The Sword in the Stone, but also the Mary Stuart books and the movies, and he's still there. Was there a sort of a period where he wasn't in favour, or is it just a relatively recent, as in since the 1950s, 60s, that Merlin and Arthur are back in fashion, if you like, or was he, during the Victorian era and Georgian era, was he still a character?
Well, there is a period, usually round about the time of the English Civil War, when stories of this kind, stories about magic and knights and so forth, were definitely out of favour. It was the Cromwellian period when, nothing exciting or wonderful like that was allowed. Yes. But apart from that, even in the 17th century, one of the queens, Queen Caroline, actually built a little kind of building in Vauxhall Gardens, and she employed an actor to sit inside there and be Merlin, and card readings like tarot and so forth, so people could actually come and consult Merlin. And she was absolutely obsessed with the stories and absolutely loved them. So it kind of kept awareness there. And there were a lot of sort of Merlin's almanacs were published over the years, which of course were full of, this is what's going to happen on the 6th of March, 1604 or something like that. And so throughout that period, they were there. The Morte d'Arthur, the Mallory story, for instance, has been almost constantly in print since 1485, when Caxton did the first edition. But there was a little period when it wasn't, and this was largely because of a particular writer who said that the Morte d'Arthur ought not to be read by anybody because it was full of bold bawdy. He thought it was all about, love and sex and warfare, and which it is, of course, and these things shouldn't be read. So for a little while it was out of print, and that more or less at the same time people were still interested in Arthur, but there wasn't so much knowledge. Even John Milton just wanted to write a great epic about Arthur. Seriously considered it, and then decided instead to write about the fall of Lucifer and the paradise and the whole of that story instead. So it never really went away. It kind of went slightly underground. There was less interest, but come the 19th century, it rolls back. We have Tennyson, the Idylls of the King, writing this extraordinary series of poems that Queen Victoria loved. In fact, she loved them so much that she had a portrait painted of herself and Prince Albert as Arthur and Guinevere, and had the robing room in the Houses of Parliament painted with scenes from the Arthurian legends. They're still there. You can see them. So at that point, Arthur suddenly became very big news, and Merlin along with him, of course. And then the Pre-Raphaelites came along. And so you have perhaps one of the most famous portraits of Merlin, if you like, was by Edward Burne-Jones, one of the greatest of the Pre-Raphaelite painters, who did Merlin and Nimue. And it much followed the pattern of that story, where he's an older man. He's not shown as a white-bearded, white-haired guy, but he's an older man, and he's kind of lying back, against a tree, looking very forlorn, and this very powerful woman standing over him, weaving a spell. This is Nimue. So again, you have at that point, you've got that whole story is brought to the fore. And, Merlin is the sort of washed out fellow that's controlled by the powerful, sexy woman, is suddenly the story that everybody's hearing. So it goes on. It goes on pretty much uninterrupted through the 19th century into the 20th. And then you get this huge rash of new fiction. You mentioned the Mary Stuarts. Her trilogy tells the story of Merlin in a very interesting way. Actually, she did go back to the idea of Merlin as a prophet and as a seer, because he goes into his crystal cave. An idea that's become so ingrained in our consciousness that now people think it's part of the original story. It's not. She was the one who came up with that. In the same way that T.H. White comes up with the idea of Merlin living backwards, which for him was a joke.
Yeah.
But that's now, I've had that quoted to me so often. Know? So it's always keeps on going. And then you started getting the movies, and of course Merlin's always present.
Yes.
In all of them in one form or another. I think the best, to me anyway, the best is that portrayal of Nicole Williamson in Excalibur, with Merlin with his shining dome of a helmet.
Yeah.
Really exciting stuff.
Yeah.
So it goes on and goes on.
Looking in your book here, and you've got the section on the Return of Merlin, where you say that in the Harry Potter books, Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, is very much a Merlin-like character.
Absolutely so, and I think that J.K. Rowling has acknowledged that certainly she was aware of the Merlin story when she was writing it, and the same goes for the Star Wars films, in which we have Obi-Wan Kenobi, who once again is doing exactly the same thing. He's raising this unknown boy to become a very powerful figure within the galaxy, So they're following the same pattern, and George Lucas admits that when he was writing the screenplay, he had particularly been interested in a book by I'm going to forget his name now, Campbell. Lucas was reading a book that had a lot to do with the shape of the earlier stories of heroes, legends, myths, and wizards and so forth, and certainly had that in mind when he was writing the screenplay for the first of the Star Wars movies. And Obi-Wan is definitely recognizable as a Merlin-type figure, in the same way in the very famous Star Trek. I've always felt there was some interesting parallels there, because Captain Kirk in the original series, of course, has Mr. Spock. And Mr. Despite being an alien, is a wise man. He's the guide, if you like, for Kirk all the time. And what do? All of those guys, they sit in a circular chamber with a round table. So again, echoes.
Yeah.
On the Bridge of Surprise, there is Arthur and Merlin once again.
Yeah. What about Tolkien? I mean, Gandalf seems to be very much a Merlin-like character.
Oh, I think definitely. Again, certainly Tolkien had a very kind of on-off relationship towards this mythology. I had an exchange with him in letters years ago, in which he said, "I'm not really very interested in the Arthurian stories because they're too French." That was how he put it, which I think is wrong, but because they're not.
Yeah.
If anything, they're Celtic, but Celtic is certainly very much part of here. Yes, his knowledge obviously was encyclopedic for these stories, and in many ways, Gandalf is the most clear echo of Merlin, because again, he is a kingmaker. He helps Aragorn become king and defeat his enemies, and he is, to all intents and purposes, if you look at the portrayal of him, particularly in the films, you could just swap him over any way you like, and he'd be Merlin. Has the same kind of wit and wisdom. Even wears the pointed hat.
Yes.
Which I felt annoyed by. I always feel. I think I said in one of my earlier books that I really wanted to get away from the idea of Merlin with the pointy hat and the starry robe, who was how people see wizards.
Yes.
Because wizards didn't necessarily wear pointy hats. You may have noticed on the front of the book, of this new book, that it's a character from a woodcut, which is a medieval woodcut, showing him wearing a kind of conical hat. But it's not the pointed hat of the wizard. And I always think that that's a bit of a joke in a way, and I'm sorry again that Disney decided to portray him in that way in the Sword in the Stone. It'd be very interesting. I don't know if you know that they're making a live version of the animated movie at the moment. I've no idea who's playing Merlin.
No, I haven't seen anything about that. I do know, obviously, that Disney are doing live versions of all their classic animations. The most recent being Mulan, which is out this week. Well,
the Sword in the Stone is coming, I think, next year. Yeah. It's already in production, and I'm not sure, as I say, who's playing Merlin or Arthur or anything, but it'll be very interesting to see if he's portrayed utterly at, as a, again, as rather a sort of bumbling chap, who sings songs, or whether they'll try and make him less like that. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah, certainly with Milan, that they've gone completely away from the original version. There's no songs and there's an unhappy ending, I think. But
I haven't seen it yet, of course, but it sounds that I like. I mean, I saw the Lady and the Tramp one that they did, and that was terrible, I thought, and the Dumbo one was just strange. I never quite know. It depends who the director is and how they're going to handle it, but. Certainly been interesting to see, because they keep on. There's always, it's very current still. There's always a new version coming along. I'm actually very much at the beginning of working on something myself that may eventually appear on TV as a series. But there's always a new version. The latest is Cursed, as I mentioned earlier. I personally don't like, because it plays around with the story too much, and in that. The character of Merlin is a kind of drunken, slightly drug addict character who kind of wanders around making things happen, and once again looking after or being connected to the great sword, to the mysterious sword of power. But they've changed so much in it that it's good enough in its own way, and the acting is fantastic in some cases, but it's just that they've played so fast and loose with the legends that, as someone who's studied those for most of my life, I get kind of, they can't do that. They shouldn't change it to that extent. And I'm probably wrong to think like that too, because literally every age, as I said earlier, every age has had its own Arthur, its own Merlin, its own Lancelot. Because every age sees their own attitudes and ideas and beliefs within that.
Yes.
So Cursed is very much based on a kind of new age fantasy idea of what they might be like. And we haven't mentioned Marion Zimmer Bradley's Mists of Avalon, which of course is one of the very famous novels that came out a few years ago, in which he is called the Merlin. She makes it a title, which again is not anywhere in the original stories.
Yeah.
But she was very independent. I met her when she was researching the Mists of Avalon, and I showed her around some of the sites at Glastonbury.
Yeah.
And the way I would be saying things like, well, this is what they say about this, but of course there's no historical background for it. And she'd say, I don't care about that. I'll use it anyway. And, it's always open to, I think, the new approach to those who have a different view of it. We've had comedy-style Merlins from America. We had the long-running TV series here about the young Merlin and the young Arthur, which was kind of interesting. It had some good ideas in it, but again, I think it went off at a bit of a tangent in a way, and they ended up being more like sort of modern teenage boys.
Yes.
Than the original characters again, and fine. That was their audience. It worked. I know people who absolutely worship those actors and the characters they played. But for me, again, being an old fogey, I wanted it to be more traditional.
Yes. It was Saturday evening TV, so.
Was, without a doubt. And there were one or two good things. As I said, I love John Hurt. John Hurt as the dragon. I mean, the voice of John
Yes.
Hurt was the dragon, was absolutely superb. And quite right, because you've got stories of the very famous story, which oddly enough is connected with Oxford, where I live, which says that Merlin buried these two huge dragons under the mound where Oxford Castle now stands, and that these dragons, one red and one white, represented the Britons and the Saxons. And there's a huge fight scene between the dragons in which finally the red dragon, representing the Britons, kills the white. And this Merlin is then on hand to interpret that to everyone and say, well, that means you're going to beat the Saxons and Britain rules forever, etc. So it was a rabble-rousing story even then.
Yeah. And what about you? You've already mentioned that you have multiple books underway in various stages of completion. What are your projects, or those you can talk about, going to be in the coming months or years?
Well, the biggest, I'm always working on 3 or 4 things at once. I've always been like that. And at the moment, I've undertaken, I'm kind of wondering if I'm not mad to twisted this, but I've undertaken what will probably be the biggest book I've ever written, which is basically a new Mallory. Mallory left out an enormous number of stories. I mean, his book is over 1,000 pages, and he put most of it in there. But he also left out almost as many stories as he put in. So right now, I'm writing a book which is called The Whole Book of King Arthur, which is Mallory's original title for what became the Morte d'Arthur. Caxton, when he printed it, retitled it The Death of Arthur, the Morte d'Arthur. Mm-hmm. I'm going back to this, and I'm looking at all of these stories. This is a first, by the way, for you, because I haven't talked about this anyway yet. But it's safe to say it now because it's all contracted and I'm working on it. I'm retelling all of these different stories, as many as I can squeeze into 500 odd pages. So the book's been illustrated by John Howe, who is one of the 2 artists, along with Alan Lee, who designed pretty much everything for the Lord of the Rings films, and is currently working on the new series for Amazon on the Silmarillion, which is also Tolkien's work. So John, who I've known for years, is now illustrating this big book, wonderfully, I might add. It's an incredible picture of Merlin he's done so far, and a few others. So that's my biggest project. I've got a few other things on the way. As I said, I'm trying to develop a TV show based on Arthur, and that one, for obvious reasons, I can't talk about. Certainly. And then I'm also hopefully writing the next 2 books in this series of children's books about the young Arthur. So those are my main projects for the moment.
Right. Keep you busy through till Christmas then.
A bit longer than that, possibly. I think probably the end of next year, if I can keep going that long and we don't all implode or the world doesn't come to an end or whatever, and Merlin doesn't appear in a chariot.
Yes.
Boy, could we use King Arthur at the moment, couldn't we?
Yes. Yes.
If ever he was going to come back, now would be a good time.
Yes. We need some prophecy of where the future is going. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
I think on that note then, well, thank you very much, John. That was excellent, fascinating tale, and it's going to see me hitting Amazon and buying a shed load of your books, I can see.
I should hope so, absolutely. Yes, well, there's quite, unfortunately, for those who do want to read them all, there are quite a lot. Yeah. And more to come.
Yeah. And for people who want to find you, presumably there's an Amazon authors page or something like that.
It's an author's page, and I also have, my wife and I, because she also writes and we write books together, we have a site called HalloQuest, which is HALLOWQUEST.org.uk.
Mm-hmm.
Find a list of all our books. You can purchase signed copies, and it tells you about all the events and the teaching that we do, because we do a lot of lectures and courses around the world. So all of that's there on HelloQuest if you want to look it for them. And anybody who wants to purchase a copy of any of the books, including Merlin, I'm very happy to sign them for you.
That's lovely. Well, I say on that note, thank you very much. Thank you for your time and good luck with all your projects.
Good day, gentlefolk. I doth have breaking news. Your Weird Tales host, Charles Christian, has written a new book called Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. 5 shocking true tales that are stranger than fiction. There's murder, mayhem, treason, incest, adultery, and worse. Read about the real antics of 9 saints. Yes, saints. 8 kings and 5 queens of England, plus the wickedest of all stepmothers. And be amazed, or horrified, or appalled, or all 3. If you love weird history, and methinks you do, hop over to Amazon for your copy of Charles Christian's Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. Grab yours now.
Once again, a big thank you to John Matthews. The Book of Merlin is published by Amberley Publishing. Check out his author's page on Amazon and also his website at hallowquest.org.uk. HallowQuest is HALLOW Quest, where you can find details of, among other things, over a dozen different tarot or tarot cards, over a dozen different tarot or tarot card decks he's been involved in designing. These include a steampunk tarot, a Sherlock Holmes tarot, an Arthurian Legends tarot, and a pre-Celtic Wildwood tarot. And that's it. Time to go. In next week's show, we have another treat in store as we are going to be talking to American journalist Matt Swain about the ghosts of rock and roll and country music, including the Forever 27 Club. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you so much for listening and please join me again next week. Until then, stay well, stay weird, stay different.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.